Near midnight, the wind picked up. A dry branch dropped onto the porch. Shadow didn't flinch. He remained on his final watch, waiting for a radio signal from command or a call from the only captain he had ever known. And in that house, cloaked in darkness, one dog kept guard outside, one sister lay sleepless inside, and one soldier rested between them, the only one who couldn't return, yet the only one neither could let go. Nora sat on the stairway, the soft yellow glow of the hallway light casting shadows across her tired face, her eyes open wide as if staring through reality itself. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but to her, time had stopped the moment that flag-covered coffin entered her home. Shadow remained on the porch, unmoving as stone. The silence was suffocating, and in that stillness, old memories returned like a film rewinding in silence. Nora remembered the summer she was 8. The house was older then. The roof still leaked in heavy rain. Their mother stayed up late sewing dresses just to afford their school books. Thomas was 13 tall, quiet. He didn't hang with friends. He mowed lawns, fixed fences, did odd jobs. Anything to ease Mom's burden. Once, when Nora scraped her knee, Thomas didn't say a word. He carried her 2 kilometers to the clinic. Along the way, he whispered, "If you keep crying, I'll cry too." It was silly, but it was the only time she saw him admit he could hurt too. Then came the winter she was 11. Their mother died of cancer. The house fell into a silence that screamed, no more cookie smells, no more coughs at night. 2 children had to grow up overnight. Thomas didn't cry at the funeral. He stood like stone beside the casket, clutching her hand so tightly it left a mark. Later, he said, "From now on, I'm both your brother and your parent." And he kept that promise. Nora looked toward the photograph on the wall taken when she was 18, the day Thomas returned on leave after his first deployment. His uniform was new, his boots still red with drill field dust, but that smile, it couldn't hide the weariness in his eyes. That was when Thomas began to change, no longer the small-town boy, but a soldier disciplined, withdrawn, silently carrying a loneliness no one dared name. That year, he brought home something special, Shadow. At first, Nora was afraid. Shadow was large, sharp-eyed, always watching her like he was assessing a threat. But Thomas was different. Every time he laid a hand on Shadow's back, his face softened, a gentleness Nora rarely saw directed even at her. "Shadow's not a pet," Thomas once said. "He's the only friend I had for 9 months in Kandahar." And it was true. Nora had seen Thomas wake from nightmares, sweating, calling names that didn't exist. And in those moments, it was Shadow who approached, rested his head on Thomas's chest, and calmed him. No commands, no words, just presence. From then on, Nora understood. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was living memory of war, of survival, of everything Thomas never spoke aloud. Tonight, sitting alone on the stairs, she recalled how Thomas looked at Shadow after morning runs. Not like a man looks at a pet, but like a soldier watching a comrade who had saved his life more than once. And now, there was only one left. Nora rose and stepped softly onto the porch. She opened the door. A gust of cold wind slipped into her collar, making her shiver. Shadow was still there, unmoving. When she sat beside him, he tilted his head to look, then turned back toward the door that had closed forever behind the man he loved. She reached out and touched the thick fur at his neck, warm, strong. as if Thomas were still there, woven into every strand, every breath, every distant gaze of this creature. "I miss you, Thomas," Nora whispered, her voice breaking. "So does he. But I think you already knew that." Shadow didn't move, but then he sighed, a slow, deep exhale, like an old wind growing tired in its chest. In that moment, the two of them, woman and dog, sat together, holding a space that could never be filled, and behind the closed door, Thomas Rourke lay silent beneath a flag folded sharp as a period. But in Nora's heart, and in Shadow's eyes, he had never left. 3 days after the quiet funeral, the air inside the small wooden house remained unchanged, not because time had failed to heal, but because the loss had never truly been accepted. Thomas's memorial photo stood solemnly on a small wooden table in the living room. The picture was simple, unframed, just a portrait Nora had taken last autumn. Thomas, in his combat uniform, giving a faint smile, eyes slightly squinting under the sunlight. It was a smile both warm and resolute, as if he knew he was carrying something greater than himself on his shoulders. Nora lit incense every morning. She wasn't religious, but the scent of incense was the only way she felt she could still talk to him, even if it was in silence. But Shadow was different, very different. Since the night Thomas's body was brought home, Shadow's behavior had begun to change. At first, it was subtle. A constant alertness in his eyes, a head that never fully bowed, a gait always tense, like a soldier on patrol. But by the 3rd day, those changes were no longer silent. That morning, as Nora prepared Shadow's water as usual, she heard a low growl from the living room. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but rhythmic and persistent, the kind of growl from an animal trying to warn or restrain itself. She stepped in and saw Shadow standing rigid, his body taut, his eyes locked on the memorial photo. He didn't bark, but the growl rumbling in his throat raised the fur down his spine. "Shadow?" Nora called gently. The dog didn't turn. He kept staring at the picture, as if there was something in that frame he couldn't understand but instinctively knew was wrong. She stepped closer, placed her hand on his back. Shadow flinched, truly startled, something that had never happened to a seasoned canine like him. "What's going on, huh?" Nora whispered. But Shadow just exhaled hard, turned away from her eyes, and backed slowly toward the door, tail lowered. That afternoon, Nora called the military veterinarian who had cared for Shadow during his retirement with Thomas. Dr. Helm arrived early. In his 50s, lean, always smelling faintly of antiseptic, he spoke with a mix of caution and pragmatism. After a full check-up joints, limbs, ears, pupils, he sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, stroking his chin. "Physically, he's fine. No fever, no injuries, no infections, no signs of vestibular issues or minor seizures." Then why does he just stare at Thomas's picture like that? Growling like it's a stranger? Helm looked at her, responding slowly. Working dogs, especially special operations canines, don't react the way regular dogs do. They encode emotion, environment, and memory into scent, into habits, into presence. When they lose someone deeply bonded, they can become disoriented. "You mean he doesn't know Thomas is dead?" "No, the opposite. I think he knows. He just doesn't accept it." Nora went quiet. That sentence struck a deep chord, one she hadn't dared admit aloud. That maybe, deep down, she too was holding on to a desperate hope. That a correction would come in the morning, that Thomas wasn't gone, that it had all been a mistake. Shadow was acting the way she felt. That night, as Nora passed through the living room, she found Shadow once again in his usual spot staring at the memorial. But this time, the anger had faded from his gaze. Now there was only stillness, emptiness, exhaustion, and she understood. He no longer growled because he had begun to realize that the photo was all that remained. She sat beside him, resting her hand on his neck. Together they looked at that image, at a man who no longer breathed, yet somehow felt more present in this house than ever before. Nora bit her lip. Tears spilled over. "I know. I can't stand it either, but he's not coming back, Shadow." The dog tilted his head, blinking slowly. Then he turned and rested his head on her lap. No bark, no growl, only silent pain and a numb resignation. That afternoon, the sky turned gray. Thick clouds hung heavy, swallowing sunlight and casting a leaden tone over the earth. Nora was watering a bed of white chrysanthemums by the fence when she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. Steady, deliberate, as though trying not to disturb the fragile air around the grieving home. An old pickup truck rolled to a stop at the gate. The door opened, and a man stepped out tall, solidly built, close-cropped hair, sun-weathered face. Something about him felt deeply familiar, but burdened. Nora didn't need to see the plates. She knew. "Sergeant Carter," she whispered, as if calling her brother's name through another man. Daniel Carter, Thomas's closest comrade. They had fought together through the blood-soaked terrains of Helmand and Kunduz. He wasn't in uniform, just a dark blue shirt, worn jeans, boots covered in dust. But his walk was unchanged, each step weighed by memory. "Hey, Nora," he said, his voice low and hoarse, as if ending a journey no one had waited for. She nodded, unable to speak. Carter didn't hug her, didn't pat her shoulder. He simply stood, his deep eyes gazing through the slightly ajar wooden door into the home, where a flag-draped coffin still lay, as if it had become a permanent part of the furniture and immutable truth. When he stepped inside, Carter stopped short. Shadow lay by the window, head resting on his forelegs, eyes weary and distant. But the moment Carter entered the room, Shadow lifted his head. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting second, something undeniably human passed between them. Not joy, not welcome, but acknowledgment. Shadow walked over slowly, heavily. He stopped in front of Carter. No bark, no tail wag, just a look. Then a slight tilt of the head, just enough to bring tears to Carter's eyes. "I know, buddy." Carter knelt, placing a hand on Shadow's neck, the very spot Thomas had once stitched after a mission, using only a field kit, a knife, and the belief that this dog had to live. "I know you miss him." Shadow exhaled softly, then turned back to his spot. His tail dragged behind him like it carried the weight of the past. Nora poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from Carter. Neither spoke for several minutes, only the sound of spoon tapping porcelain and wind brushing the curtains. Then Carter said, "There was a time in Kandahar we got ambushed. Thomas took shrapnel in the back. He was bleeding badly, but instead of calling medevac, the first thing he screamed was, 'Where's Shadow?'" "I know," Nora murmured, eyes downcast. "I didn't get it back then. He was turning blue from pain, but forced himself to move just to see Shadow. He didn't pass out until he knew the dog was alive." Silence. Carter looked toward the corner of the room where Thomas's jacket still hung neatly, as if waiting for its owner to return. "Another time, Shadow got hit by a mortar fragment. We thought he wouldn't make it. Thomas nearly lost his mind. I've never seen anyone scream a dog's name like it was his own flesh and blood. Nora raised a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Shadow, lying nearby, barely lifted an ear, yet something in his posture suggested he remembered those words by scent, by memory. "Do you think Shadow knows Thomas is dead?" Carter asked, still staring at the framed photo on the shrine. Nora nodded slowly. "He knows, but like me, he doesn't want to believe it. He won't let go." They both sat in silence. Then Carter pulled something from his pocket, a small, dented silver unit badge. "Thomas left this in his gear locker." He wrote a note. "If I don't make it home, give this to Shadow. He was a better soldier than I ever was." Nora broke down. Carter didn't look at her. He walked over to Shadow, knelt, and placed the badge gently beside him. Shadow looked at the item, sniffed it once. Then slowly he nudged it closer to his chest with his snout, holding it close. The house fell into silence again. But this time it was a silence filled with weight, with loyalty, remembrance, and a goodbye left unspoken. On Saturday morning, just days after Thomas had returned in a dark wooden coffin, an off-white envelope was hand-delivered to Nora. No doorbell, no words, just a young soldier in perfect uniform, placing the envelope on the porch railing before quietly returning to his car. The tires crunched the gravel, then vanished beyond the pine-lined road of Ashfield. Nora stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was a letter, printed on thick paper, headed with the national emblem in bold capital letters. "Department of Defense, invitation to honorary funeral for Lieutenant Thomas J. Rourke." She took a deep breath. For the first time, her brother's death wasn't just a cold midnight phone call or a photo or haunting memories. It became ceremony, history, a milestone inscribed into record. The invitation detailed the date and time, 8 a.m., Tuesday next week, at St. Dunstan Chapel, Fort Brevin Military Base, Virginia. But it was the small line at the bottom that made her pause longer than anything else. Family and unit members of Lieutenant Rourke are invited to attend. This includes K-9 Shadow, member of Bravo 9 Unit, as per retired combat K-9 protocol. Nora's hands trembled. Shadow wasn't being treated as a pet. He wasn't tagging along. He was on the list recognized as a soldier saying goodbye to his fallen comrade. That afternoon, Nora asked Carter to come help with the logistics. He read the letter, brow furrowed, then nodded slowly. They don't usually do this. Letting a K-9 into a formal military funeral is extremely rare. But if its Shadow makes sense. Why? Because in Bravo 9, Shadow wasn't just a working dog. He was one of the few K-9s trained to run life-or-death ops with Special Forces. The way Thomas trusted him, it was like trusting a teammate to watch your back. If Thomas was the last to fall in that squad, then Shadow's the last one standing. Nora stayed quiet. Last one standing tightened her chest. Not because it wasn't true, but because it reminded her of a bitter truth. Thomas was gone, and though Shadow was alive, it seemed he had never left the battlefield. That evening, Nora sat in the living room, carefully smoothing out the black dress she would wear to the funeral. Shadow lay in the corner, his head resting on her foot, eyes still watching the shrine. She turned toward him, her voice soft. "They're letting you go, Shadow. They recognize you as a soldier, as his teammate." Shadow didn't react right away, but moments later he stood, walked slowly to the chair Thomas used to read in. He sat, not a sound, not a whine, just sat, as if he understood, as if he was waiting for his final duty. The next morning, Nora took Shadow for a final checkup before the funeral. Doctor, Helm placed the stethoscope gently to Shadow's chest, listening to each steady heartbeat. He's still tense mentally, but physically he's fine. Stronger than any retired K-99 I've seen. Helm smiled. He'll manage, but you should prepare. Dogs like this, when they've completed their final mission, sometimes they let go. Let go? They live to serve, and when there's no one left to protect, they choose to stop. That sentence haunted Nora all the way home. She watched Shadow in the rearview mirror, sitting calmly in the back seat, head slightly tilted, eyes gazing out the window. The weariness of the past days had faded, but there was something else in his eyes now. Readiness, as if he knew this funeral wasn't just for Thomas. It would be the last time he would get to be a soldier. The day was approaching, and inside that quiet house among the pine trees, two souls prepared for something no heart is ever ready for. A sister burying her brother, and a four-legged warrior fulfilling the final order of his life. Bring your comrade home. Early morning. The sky had not fully brightened, but the gray light had begun to separate heaven from earth. A thin silver mist clung to the entrance of St. Dunstan Chapel, an old stone building nestled quietly among the pine groves of Fort Brevern Military Base. The chapel wasn't large, but there was something about it that made everyone who stepped inside suddenly feel smaller, as if the very stones and bricks bowed their heads in reverence to grief. The heavy wooden doors opened with a soft creak, echoing gently in the still air. The scent of wax, old oak, and a faint trace of lilies floated between each breath. The ceiling arched high overhead, and colored stained glass windows cast patches of violet and blue across the stone floor. Morning light filtered through the central pane to the east, a depiction of St. Michael with sword drawn creating a cold blue glow like light on a frozen lake. In the heart of the chapel lay a dark wooden coffin, draped with the folded American flag creased perfectly, not a single corner misaligned, not a thread out of place, as if that very perfection were an unspoken apology. We couldn't keep him safe. Beside the coffin, a single large candle burned slowly. The flame flickered, but did not waver, as if symbolizing the unwavering resolve of the soldier lying silent beneath it, even after the storms of life had passed. The front pews were filled with soldiers' former comrades, commanding officers. A few faces Nora recognized from the photos Thomas had sent home. All wore formal dress uniforms, collars crisp, boots shining like mirrors. But their eyes, no matter how disciplined, shared the same look: grief and the quiet fear that one day they too might lie there. No one spoke, no coughs, no shifting bodies, only the sound of breath heavy, steady, quiet as a muted gunshot. They sat like bronze statues, not because of regulation, but because the man lying there had once been part of their own flesh and blood. Nora sat in the second row, directly behind the soldiers. She wore a long black dress, her hands gently gripping the framed portrait of her brother. The photo was no longer just an image. It was a hollow space, a stark proof that the boy she had grown up with, had fought over toast with on Sunday mornings, who had calmed her through childhood nightmares, now existed only inside a frame. Her hair was tied back, no makeup, no tears, but her eyes red and dry looked like a door blown open by wind, yet the homeowner hadn't stepped out to see what had been lost. The chapel bell rang at exactly 8 clew, a single chime, sharp, brief. Every eye turned to the main entrance, but no one stood up. They all understood. This wasn't a ceremony to witness someone arrive. It was a farewell to someone who never would again. The air thickened, not from the number of people, but from the weight of things left unsaid, words never spoken, glances never exchanged, embraces never given. A suffocating kind of silence, not one that chokes you all at once, but one that makes each breath taste like ash. An elderly pastor stepped out from the preparation room, robed in faded white vestments, holding a worn Bible. He didn't speak right away. He stood before the coffin, bowed deeply, and held the ball for so long the room thought he was praying. But perhaps he was simply a man bowing in utter helplessness before death. Nora looked at Thomas, or rather, the coffin. She wondered, if I ran forward now and tore open the wooden lid, would it be his face I saw? Or is memory just playing one last cruel trick before it fades for good? Her hand clenched the frame. Fingernails dug into her palm until it bled, but she didn't feel pain. The real pain was already in front of her. And so the service began. In a chapel not wide, but wide enough to hold an eternal love, silent enough to hear the sound of a breaking heart, and cold enough to know that true cold only comes when the one you love is no longer by your side. A side door of the chapel opened slightly. Pale light stretched across the stone floor, casting the silhouette of a figure familiar and yet so sacred that the entire chapel seemed to hold its breath. Shadow entered. No bark, no echo of pause. The black and gray German shepherd advanced slowly, each step dignified, as if still patrolling the deserts of Kandahar, where dust and gunfire were part of life. But today there were no explosions, only silence cold and sharp as steel. Beside him, a young officer held the leash loosely, not to control him, but to follow, as if even he knew. In this sacred space, he was the one being led. Every eye turned toward the door. A few soldiers bowed their heads, as if saluting a superior officer. Others unconsciously clenched their fists, because they knew this wasn't just a dog walking in. It was a remaining piece of the man inside the coffin returning, right on time. Nora turned when she sensed movement behind her. She saw Shadow instantly unmistakable, the gait, the ears, but especially the eyes. The eyes that had once saved Thomas's life, that had helped him through countless nightmare-ridden nights in their home. For the first time in the entire service, Nora felt her heart stutter, not from pain, but from something deeper, faith. Shadow's symbol of survival, of unwavering loyalty had come, and from that moment, Thomas was no longer alone. The dog moved past the rows of seats, no sound, no pause. His sharp eyes scanned every face, every candle, every detail, not from suspicion, but searching for signs, for breath, for the one he was trained to live and die beside. And then he stopped. Shadow saw the coffin. He stood motionless, ears erect, body frozen in a room full of people. But in that moment, only two existed, Shadow and the flag-covered casket. A sound emerged barely audible, impossible to catch if you weren't truly listening. A whimper, not loud, not long, but enough to slice through the veil of silence covering every soul in the chapel. A few soldiers bowed their heads, jaws clenched. Nora clutched her chest, trying to steady her breath. Carter Thomas's old war buddy leaned forward, as if physically unable to look away from that moment, and Shadow didn't move. His eyes locked on the casket, as if trying to smell through the wood to confirm something no one could ever explain to him with words. The officer beside him gently tugged the leash. Shadow didn't budge. The man whispered, "He's in there. You know, don't you?" Shadow gave no sign. He simply sat slowly, heavily eyes, never leaving the casket. That was not the gaze of a dog for his owner. It was the gaze of a soldier standing before the coffin of his commander. Then, very gently, Shadow bowed his head until it nearly touched the cold stone floor. No one had trained him to do it. No one had given the command. But he did it anyway. Some soldiers in the front row instinctively placed their hands over their hearts as if returning a salute, even if it came from a dog, or perhaps not just a dog. Nora gripped the photo in her lap. Her throat tightened, not from tears, but from the overwhelming sense that Thomas was close, not inside the coffin, but somewhere in Shadow's eyes. In that bow, in that broken-hearted whimper, something only he had the right to voice. And then silence returned. But this was no longer the silence of death. It was the silence of absolute reverence for a friendship without words, a sorrow without sound, and a farewell needing no reply. The chapel remained draped in that heavy silence, a silence not just of solemnity, but of emotions buried so deep they trembled just beneath the surface. Everything seemed frozen, the light from the stained glass pooling like cold smoke on the floor, the air thick with the scent of melting wax and lilies beginning to wilt. Shadow still sat, just a few feet from the casket. No more whimpers, no more bowing, only watching. His dark, deep, unwavering gaze fixed on the flag-covered box. Then suddenly, he stood, no warning, no sound. In a heartbeat, Shadow lunged forward, body taut with intention. The officer couldn't react in time. Snap! The leash pulled tight, then slipped from the young soldier's grasp. In that instant, the entire chapel held its breath. Shadow shot forward like an arrow, unyielding, straight, unwavering. His nails tapped against the stone floor, sharp, cold, like the sound of echoes from the grave. And then he leaped, thud. His paws landed atop the wooden coffin. The American flag slipped slightly, a corner folding askew as if even the symbol of honor had to make room for a love that transcended protocol. A gasp escaped from somewhere in the pews. Some stood, others covered their mouths. But no one stepped forward. No one dared, because what they were witnessing did not belong to the ordinary world. Shadow pressed his head into the edge of the casket, where a small window allowed family to see the face of the departed one last time. His nose touched the glass, slid along the wooden rim, searching for a breath, for a heartbeat, for a scent. He found nothing, but he didn't stop. He whimpered so softly only those closest could hear, but it tore through every rib cage in that chapel. Not a cry of anger, not of fear, but the sound born from the heart of one who had lost the only thing that gave him purpose. Then Shadow lay down. He curled atop the casket, resting his head on the very spot Thomas once placed his hand. His breaths were ragged, as if trying not to sob. His tail curled toward his belly. His ears drooped completely, his limbs tucked in tight, not the posture of a warrior, but of a child left alone in the battlefield. The chapel was utterly still. No military funeral had ever ended this way. No soldier had ever been honored quite like this. Nora rose to her feet. She clutched the photo so tightly her nails dug into the frame, but she didn't step forward, didn't call out. She understood this was not a moment for humans to intervene. This was a moment between two souls, one lying still and one trying desperately to call him back from the void. Carter tilted his head, swallowing hard. The hardened soldier could no longer hold his expression. His eyes shimmered. His hand trembled against his knee. "God," he whispered, "he really won't leave him." The pastor stood behind the pulpit, one hand trembling on the spine of his worn Bible. He said nothing. No one did, because there were no words, no scripture, no regulation that could explain what was unfolding. A dog had leapt onto his master's casket, not because he was called, not because he was trained, but because he could no longer bear the distance between one heart still beating and one that had stopped. And so, in that ancient chapel beneath the candlelight, the blue stained glass, and dozens of soldiers who knew death well, every eye turned to one being, not wearing a uniform, not bearing a medal, but who had just carried out a rite more sacred, more complete, and more heartbreaking than any present had ever witnessed. No one moved, no sound stirred in the chapel, except the soft crackling of candle flames and the increasingly rapid breathing of shadow, curled tightly atop the coffin. Veteran soldiers' men who had kept their nerves steady on the razor's edge between life and death now dared not even blink, because they knew they were witnessing something beyond anything training could ever prepare them to understand. Shadow stretched forward. His posture wasn't tense, but neither was it at ease. His entire body quivered softly, paws trembling as they pressed against the now shifted folds of the American flag. His claws touched the glass above Thomas's chest, and then slowly he nudged it with his nose. Once, nothing. He nudged again, softer, more urgently, a signal, a ritual, a reflex from deep within. "Wake up, Captain." Nora stood behind him, barely breathing. Her hands were clenched, bone-white, lips pressed so tight they'd split. Her heart cracked in slow, silent fractures. Carter whispered, perhaps only to himself, "That's how he used to wake Thomas every time he went down on the battlefield." A senior officer took a step forward, then stopped. He reached out, then pulled his hand back, eyes torn with emotion. No one could pull Shadow down, not out of fear, but because no one had the right, because in that moment the soft nudge, the trembling whimper that was the final connection between two soldiers who had once stood side by side in a world where life hung by a thread. Shadow pressed his muzzle to the glass again, this time not urgent, just a gentle touch, as if whispering to Thomas, "Just move, just a little, so I'll know you're still here." But Thomas didn't move, no breath, no sign. And then, as though something within finally understood what the heart had refused to believe, Shadow stopped. He pulled his head back, tilted slightly, and looked directly into Thomas's face. That gaze lasted only a few seconds, but to everyone present it held a lifetime, a life of loyalty, of bond, of protection and sacrifice. Shadow's eyes, once sharp and brave on the battlefield, were now calm as a lake before a storm, no longer searching, no longer waiting for orders, only surrender. The entire chapel froze into a painting, a scene captured in silence and candlelight. Only the flickering flames remained alive. The blue-tinted light from the stained glass windows painted pale colors across Shadow's gray-black fur, as though departed souls had gathered to embrace him in an invisible farewell, and Thomas, though motionless, somehow felt present in that stillness. No words, no hugs, just a final look from the one who had always stood watch over him. Shadow lay down. This time, not curled up. He lay along the length of the casket, his head resting gently above Thomas's chest, front paws placed over the flag, tail tucked in close, a posture of complete surrender. No one stepped forward. No one gave a command. Even the pastor paused, his hand frozen over the open Bible, unable to turn the page. He was crying silently, without expression, yet a single tear traced down his cheek and soaked into his beard. And there, within a military chapel meant for structured rituals, handshakes, and ceremonial honors, a dog had just delivered a final lesson to all who had gathered. That loyalty needs no certificate. That love needs no language. And that when hearts are truly bound, death cannot sever, only delay the next reunion. No one spoke. The chapel descended into a silence so deep it sent shivers down spines. Not the silence of reverence or tradition, but the kind that makes you hold your breath because you're no longer sure if what you're witnessing is real or not. Shadow still lay beside the coffin, head pressed against Thomas's chest. He looked as though he had accepted, had let go, had made peace. But then his whole body tensed. A low growl rumbled from his throat, dry, subtle, not loud, but unmistakably a warning. Carter, who had fought beside both Thomas and Shadow, immediately sat upright. He knew that sound. He sees something. Shadow's eyes widened, his pupils narrowed. In one smooth motion his body sprang upright, as if an invisible signal had just pierced the air, triggering something deep in his instinct. He no longer looked at Thomas, no longer pressed his head to the coffin. Shadow stared, unmoving, toward a far corner at the back of the chapel. That area was darker than the rest, not from a lack of light, but because the cold blue glow of the stained glass windows didn't quite reach there. Nora followed Shadow's gaze instinctively, and her heart seemed to skip a beat. There was nothing there, no figure, no shadow, just a faded patch of wall beneath an old wooden crucifix. But what chilled her to the bone was Shadow's expression. He wasn't just staring. He was recognizing something, as if someone was standing there, as if he saw them. She could feel goosebumps rise along her arms. A chill slid through her hair, down her spine like the brush of something unseen. A young female soldier in the back row exhaled, whispering to the person beside her, "I swear, I saw something move in that corner, a shape or something." The others shook their head, but their eyes, too, were uncertain. Carter said nothing. He'd seen Shadow detect mines, sniff out explosives, identify blood trails from dozens of meters away, but never like this. No barking, no snarling, just that razor gaze. And a body held in readiness. Shadow stared ahead, ears perked, muscles low to the ground, poised either to defend or to protect, as if facing an unseen enemy that only he could sense. Chaplain Ed, the elderly pastor standing by the pulpit, froze. Then, in a breath of calm resolve, he took a step forward. His voice wasn't loud. He didn't try to command the space, but it carried enough for all to hear. Dogs can feel what human eyes cannot see. No one contradicted him. No one chuckled. Even the skeptics held their breath. Because in this room, everything familiar now felt foreign, and the impossible suddenly seemed very possible. Nora turned to Carter, whispering, lips trembling, "What do you think he sees?" Carter didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on Shadow on that darkened corner they both now stared at. Then he said, "Maybe Thomas, or something that used to be him. I don't know. But that dog's never reacted like that, to empty space." Shadow growled again, not angry, not fearful, but a sound of acknowledgment, of alert, of presence. Then, slowly, the sound faded. His gaze softened. He bowed his head, then returned to the side of the coffin. But just before lying down, he glanced back at the corner, as if to say, "I know you're there." Nora clutched the photo to her chest, tears falling without warning, not from fear, but because she felt something. Thomas wasn't far, not an illusion, not a hope, but something warm, unexplainable, like an invisible hand had just rested gently on her shoulder. And when Shadow pressed his head against the coffin once more, the air in the chapel shifted, fell deeper. Still, the candle flickered, not from wind, but as if an unseen breath had just passed by. Chaplain Ed bowed his head and whispered, "Some souls don't leave right away, or perhaps they stay, because something still lingers." Every gaze turned to one place, to Shadow, the faithful canine, who had just lifted his head once more from the coffin and lay flat, not in rest, but in the position of a soldier receiving final orders. His head touched Thomas's chest, front legs stretched forward, chest pressed to the wooden lid, his eyes half closed, breathing steady. But he did not leave his post. No one dared interrupt. A high-ranking officer took a step forward, intending to lift Shadow away. But as he bent down, he froze, because a voice low, clear, and full of emotion rose from the altar. Chaplain Ed, the old pastor who had presided over far too many military funerals. He wasn't speaking to the living. He looked directly at Shadow. "There are things," he said, voice soft as wind, yet clear in the heavy air, "only dogs can sense." A young soldier swallowed hard. Another lowered their head. Nora, in her dark dress, clutching the photo, closed her eyes for a second. No one objected, no one scoffed, because in that moment something inside each of them silently agreed. Chaplain Ed stepped slowly toward the head of the coffin. He brought no Bible, gave no sermon. He simply stood there bearing witness and continued almost to himself. Dogs don't need language. They feel with their hearts. They take commands by instinct, by the rhythm of a bond, and when their person is gone, they don't leave. They wait. He paused. Shadow's waiting for his final order. Carter, a few rows back, inhaled deeply, his fists clenched not from anger, but because he knew every word to be true. Shadow had crossed minefields for a wave of Thomas's hand, had fought off insurgents in the dark with no sound, only a look, and now Thomas lay still. But Shadow still believed, still waited, still kept watch. Nora bowed low, tears dripping onto her polished black shoes. Shadow didn't howl, didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply lay there, silent, steadfast, as if his very body with its heartbeat, its breath, its presence was the final barrier protecting the soul of the fallen soldier. Chaplain Ed continued, no script, no notes, each word already buried in his heart. We are human. We make sense of death with religion, with science, with tears. But there are creatures who don't need sense. All they need is a glance, a scent, and they know the soul is still here. The entire chapel seemed suspended in stillness. Outside, The morning blue light spilled softly through the stained glass, illuminating the arch of Shadow's back. That cold glow did not make him shiver. He simply lay there, motionless, like part of the ritual, uninvited but essential. Chaplain Ed stepped closer, kneeled, and placed a trembling hand on Shadow's head, not to pull him away, just to touch, as one would touch the shoulder of a final sentinel. "At ease, soldier," he whispered, "the command to stand down, the permission to rest." Shadow did not move at first, but Nora in that moment saw his ears twitch, then a breath, soft, deep, as if he had heard, understood, and finally accepted. A weathered soldier wiped his eyes. A young medic clenched the pew's edge. Carter whispered to himself, "We don't deserve their love." Shadow tucked his head once more beside Thomas. No more struggle, no more growl, only loyalty pure, absolute, and a feeling that filled every heart in that chapel. This was not just a dog. This was the final heartbeat still echoing for the soldier who no longer woke. Years ago, a land halfway across the world from America, Kandahar, Afghanistan. The heat burned like fire, fine dust clung into every crevice of the armor, and the roar of helicopters echoed day and night like the war's racing heartbeat. At Forward Operating Base, 14 Southern Outpost Private Thomas Whitaker was the youngest member of Bravo 6 Squad. Barely 22, his eyes held more anxiety than grit. He was assigned to the unit led by Sergeant Carter, and on his first day, he met Shadow. "This is your new partner," Carter said, holding tightly onto a thick leash. A dog that stood nearly waist-high to Thomas, a dark German shepherd with eyes sharp as a drawn blade. Thomas frowned. I'm not really good with dogs." Carter chuckled, not kindly, but with the dry tone of a seasoned soldier who had heard this 100 times. "You don't need to be good, just don't get in his way." Thomas kept his distance at first. So did Shadow. The dog showed no excitement toward the young soldier. It ate alone, slept away from the group, and when Thomas called its name, Shadow would glance his way and turn away, cold, tough, just like everything else on this battlefield. Thomas even thought to himself, "It's a machine, nothing more." But on the 19th day of the operation, fate turned the wheel. It was a gray morning when Bravo 6 received orders to patrol the western outskirts, a zone known for scattered IEDs. Shadow took the lead, nose sniffing, ears erect, his behavior sharp and mechanical as always. Thomas followed second line, rifle angled, eyes scanning every low rooftop. No one suspected the IED hidden beneath an old storm drain. As they passed the third alley, a soft click echoed beneath Thomas's boot. Then a yell from Carter. "Down!" But it was too late. Boom! Thomas was hurled against a dirt wall. His left shoulder slammed hard, his ears rang, blood poured over his eye. The world spun. Gunfire erupted. Enemy fire from a second-story window rained down like a storm. A calculated ambush. He reached for his M4, but his arm wouldn't move. Then he saw it, something rushing through the smoke. Not a soldier, no body armor, running on 4 legs. Shadow. The dog barreled toward Thomas like a living missile. No orders, no hesitation. Shadow stopped right in front of him, growling at the enemy soldier aiming from the balcony. Bang! A shot rang out, not from the enemy, but from Carter, a covering shot. Shadow grabbed the strap of Thomas's pack and used every muscle in his body to drag the wounded soldier toward the wall, pulling, sliding, whimpering softly. Every second was a battle with death. Blood mixed with dust. The ground quaked under stray bullets. Thomas couldn't see clearly, but he saw those eyes. Shadow's eyes, unafraid, unwavering, holding one message: I won't leave you. Eventually, the squad returned fire and pulled them both back to the field medical post. Carter later said, Shadow didn't leave your side. He bit my arm when I tried to hold him back. That night, for the first time, Thomas, wrapped in bandages, looked down at Shadow lying beneath his cot, eyes glowing gold and silent, keeping watch. And for the first time, he called the dog's name not out of duty, but out of something deeper. Shadow! The dog looked up. Slowly, it stepped forward and rested its chin on the edge of the bed. A long breath, a soft sigh, a forgiveness, a quiet hello. From that moment on, those two shadows, man and dog, were no longer separate. No further training needed, no more time to bond. They had become part of each other, and for the first time since arriving in this war zone, Thomas didn't feel alone. He had a friend not of blood and bone, but of pure, unquestioning loyalty. There were no breaks in war, and in the smoky mountains of southeastern Afghanistan, there was no such thing as a peaceful day. But within Bravo 6, among faces hardened by gunfire and grief, the pair of Thomas and Shadow became a silent anchor everyone leaned on. Within 3 months of that first rescue, Shadow was no longer a working dog. He was a soldier without a rifle. And Thomas? From a nervous private, he grew into a sharp, resilient warrior, because beside him was a pair of eyes that stayed open even when he slept. Two blades from the same forge, Carter once said, half joking, half in awe. If Thomas jumps into fire, Shadow will jump first. And sadly, that once actually happened. That day, Bravo was ordered to recon a small village near the Pakistan border. Intelligence suggested the enemy had built an underground tunnel system for smuggling grenades and munitions. Thomas and Shadow were tasked to lead the infiltration of both in light armor, rifles ready, but fingers off the trigger. That was the rule, until civilians were confirmed absent. As they crept through a narrow alley between two stone houses, Shadow stopped cold. His nose twitched, ears straight like antennas. Thomas knew the sign. He froze, tightening his grip on the rifle. Then a faint click came from the rooftop, too soft for a human ear, but Shadow spun and shoved Thomas to the ground just as a bullet sliced past his cheek. Gunfire exploded across the village. The squad rushed in, but Thomas and Shadow were pinned between two fields of fire. Thomas slipped, hitting a wall, his leg cracking as pain screamed through his bones. He shouted, his rifle skidding away. He tried to crawl, but the agony shattered his will. Then Shadow chose. He didn't flee. He didn't retreat. He stood between Thomas and the bullets, baring his teeth like he was howling at the world. No one touches him! A bullet tore through the side of Shadow's vest. He whimpered, but didn't back down. Thomas, barely conscious, saw clearly. Shadow was shielding his chest and head with his body without command. Without hesitation, Bravo charged in. Enemy fire was suppressed. The attacker was captured. But amid the chaos of the firefight, the one sound Thomas could never forget was the heavy, labored breath of Shadow. After the battle, Thomas was carried on a stretcher. Shadow was treated on site. The bullet hadn't hit any organs, but the wound ran deep. In the medevac, Thomas turned his head toward the bloody, fur-matted figure beside him, and for the first time, in front of the others, he didn't issue a command. He whispered, voice thick with emotion, "I owe you, Shadow." The dog didn't respond, but his half-closed eyes never left the young soldier. Carter would say later during the debrief, "If not for Shadow, we'd have lost a man today. He's not just a K-9. He's the soul of Bravo." From that day, every soldier from commanders to rookies called Thomas and Shadow the Twin Blades. They were never separated. In fact, during later missions, if Thomas was more than 20 meters away from Shadow, the dog would howl, tug the leash, and force his way back. Every single time, each night, after raids and battles, the others would scatter and rest. But Thomas always left a space beside his bed where Shadow lay, head resting on crossed paws, eyes half open, as if ready to wake the camp at the slightest sound. No one taught him that. No one trained him to love that way. He just knew one thing. Protecting Thomas was the reason he existed. And Thomas? He once wrote in a journal, one that Nora would one day read, "I'm not sure if angels exist, but if they do, they probably walk on 4 legs." Friendship born in war is different. It's forged in gunfire, blood on boots, and nights where a single missed glance could mean never seeing each other again. Between Shadow and Thomas, it wasn't just a bond, it was a merging of souls, and that was what made that later funeral unforgettable. When Thomas signed the discharge papers, no one gave a big speech, no trumpets, no grand farewell, just a firm handshake from Carter commander, turned brother, and a gentle pat behind Shadow's ear. "Rest easy, warrior," Carter whispered, voice catching in his throat. Shadow didn't understand the words, but somehow he knew everything was about to change. The base faded behind the truck's window. Thomas sat at the wheel, wearing a plain T-shirt. His face no longer held the sharp edge of a soldier, but the stillness of someone who had survived the line between life and death for too long. In the passenger seat, Shadow lay still, head on the windowsill, the wind-fluttered ears that drooped slightly with age, but his eyes stayed wide open, as if guarding this final ride. No words were needed. They both knew. This was a goodbye, not just to war, but to part of themselves. Thomas didn't return to the city. He drove through low hills and shadowed pine trees and stopped at a place with a few wooden cabins, scattered rice fields, and roosters crowing each morning. A small farm on the outskirts of Montana. He bought it with 7 years' worth of combat pay. No neighbors, no sirens, no news, just earth, wind, and a sky wide enough for silence. Shadow hopped off the truck and sniffed the new air. He didn't recognize the scent of young grass, hay, or wild flowers, but he didn't bark, didn't hesitate, just followed Thomas. And for the first time in years, Thomas wasn't wearing a sidearm. The first days passed slowly. Mornings, Thomas brewed coffee and sat on the porch, watching the sun rise behind the trees. Shadow lay at his feet, ears perked as if still on watch in some desert flat. Thomas would joke, "You may have left the war, but the war hasn't left you." Shadow didn't react, but every night he patrolled the yard in silence, eyes scanning the dark like a living radar. He didn't know what retirement meant. He only knew, where there's a master, there's a mission. Thomas learned how to breathe again, how to watch rain, how to bake bread, how to camp in the backyard and journal. Not for reports, not for orders, but because his heart had things to say. And Shadow, the dog who once tore through gunfire to save him, now napped under the porch, twitching only when Thomas disappeared too long. On his 30th birthday, Thomas stuck a single candle into a homemade butter cookie, placed it on a ceramic plate. No friends, no laughter, just yellow light spilling through a wooden window and his own voice, deep and soft. "We made it, Shadow." Shadow pulled his ears back, stepped forward, and licked his hand. No other words were needed. But deep down, Thomas knew he hadn't truly left the war. Each night the dreams came, the scent of gunpowder, the scream of helicopters, and sometimes a blood-soaked hand with no face. But one thing held him to this world, the feel of Shadow's head on his legs, the eyes that watched him wake, drenched in sweat. Every time he trembled, the dog nudged his chest as if to say, "You're still here. You're safe now." Time passed slowly. Seasons of falling leaves, blooming weeds, the hammering of nails on old wood, and Thomas's footsteps less strong, but more steady than ever. And Shadow, though aging with every day, still walked by his side. They didn't need to talk, because some friendships don't need words. They just need presence. It was a farewell to war, a quiet handshake with freedom, and a new chapter where a soldier and his dog no longer roared at death, but learned how to live together in sunlight, in wind, and in dreams that no longer bled. That afternoon, the sky was cloaked in ashen gray, as if nature itself was mourning a fallen soldier. The iron gate to the military cemetery creaked open softly, giving way to the slow-moving convoy of vehicles. No sirens, no roaring engines. Everything was so subdued that even the breeze seemed to carry a solemn reverence. The flag-draped casket was carefully lifted from the hearse by 8 gloved hands. Each step taken by the honor guard was in perfect sync, precise down to the millimeter, as if their marching rhythm bore the weight of a man who had fallen for his country. Lining the tall cypress trees, dozens of soldiers in ceremonial uniform stood in 2 rows, motionless like statues. Their caps were pulled low, jaws clenched. Not a single one flinched. Nora stood at the back, alongside the family, clutching a temporarily folded flag in her arms, her head bowed low. She wore a simple black dress, her face pale from sleeplessness, her eyes hollow from too many nights without tears. Beside her, Shadow stood still, a small black ribbon around his neck, embroidered with the words K9 in red in silver thread. He didn't understand the full scope of human rituals, but he knew this much. It was the last time he would be near his person. The casket was placed on a wooden stand above the freshly dug grave. The grass had been bundled aside earlier that morning, revealing moist, freshly turned soil. No one spoke, no music played, because sometimes silence is the most profound sound of all. The honor guard stepped forward. A firm, steady command rang out. 3 rifles were raised. The cemetery held its breath. Bang! The first shot cracked through the air, sharp, resounding. A formal salute to the soul now at rest. Bang! Bang! Each shot that followed struck the air like a nail into the hearts of the living. 21 rounds in total, no more, no less. Nora closed her eyes, her shoulders trembling slightly. Shadow kept his gaze fixed on the casket. His ears twitched at every shot, but his body remained still, like a soldier bidding farewell to his comrade one last time. When the final shot faded, a young soldier stepped forward. In his hands was the national flag, still draped over Thomas's casket. Every movement that followed was measured, not rushed, not hesitant, but deliberate, dictated by the weight of honor. He began to fold the flag, each fold a ritual symbolizing the values the soldier had lived for and died upholding. Left to right, tip to base, each crease crisp and sharp like a border never meant to be crossed. The flag shrank into a tight triangle, the white stars bold against the deep navy like a sky full of unshaken faith. Gloved hands carried the folded flag to Nora. The soldier knelt on one knee. His voice rang clear and solemn. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, we present this flag as a symbol of the honorable service and ultimate sacrifice of Sergeant Thomas Bennett. Nora received it with both hands. It wasn't heavy, but as she held it to her chest, it made her feel like she could barely breathe, because she knew it wasn't just cloth. It was all she had left of him. A gentle breeze stirred through the trees. The sky remained shrouded in dull gray. In the distance, the bugler raised the trumpet to his lips. The melody of taps began to play. Familiar, slow, haunting, as if drawing parting lines across the fabric of the air. Shadow flinched slightly. Then he lay down, forelegs stretched forward, head resting on the damp earth, his eyes never leaving the casket. Someone in the honor guard wiped away tears. An older soldier gave a subtle nod, a silent thank you, to Shadow, the last companion of Thomas. When the final note of the trumpet faded, the stillness deepened. No one moved. No one dared break the moment, because everyone knew in just a few more minutes Thomas would be gone forever. The burial platform stood ready. The casket would descend soon, but first they all needed a little more time to say goodbye, in silence, in memory, or in their own quiet grief. As the final notes of the bugle died, the cemetery seemed to freeze. Not even the wind moved. Everyone stood as if time itself had paused just to stretch this moment a little longer before it slipped away. And then Shadow stepped forward. No one told him to go. No one called him. No one trained him for this. He just knew. His 4 paws stepped slowly onto the dew-soaked grass. Each step deliberate, unhurried like a soldier on his final march. His graying coat shimmered faintly in the afternoon sun. His tail hung low. Ears drooped, not in fear, but under the weight of sorrow too great for his small, speechless heart. The flag-covered casket stood before him. Its wood gleamed softly in the light. Someone had placed a single white rose on top, the petals still trembling with the wind. Shadow stopped. The entire honor guard watched his every move. No one whispered. No one moved. Only reverence. Nora stood behind him, her hands clenched white, lips trembling. She couldn't speak. She didn't need to. Shadow raised his head. He didn't howl, didn't whimper, didn't bark. He simply lifted one paw and placed it gently on the wooden lid. Not hard, not shaky, so light it left no mark, yet felt like it etched his soul into the cold casket. It was a call, a signal, a final punctuation. His eyes, no one had ever seen such eyes in a dog. It wasn't just sadness. It was an abyss, deep, silent, and heartbreakingly beautiful. All members of the honor guard, nearly 24 men and women in full dress, instinctively bowed their heads. No command needed, no clock to strike the hour. Only Shadow's gaze, and that was enough. An old soldier whispered hoarsely to the one beside him, "I've been to so many funerals, but this is the first time a dog made my heart break." The man beside him said nothing. He just gripped his cap tighter and bowed deeper. Shadow remained there, paw on the coffin, eyes unwavering, his body like stone. Then he exhaled, not sharply, not wearily, but as if surrendering, admitting that what he had tried to hold on to, he now had to let go. He withdrew his paw, slowly, gently, then turned and returned to Nora's side without needing to be told. Nora knelt, wrapping her arms around Shadow. She pressed her forehead to his. No words, none needed, because now she understood. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was what remained of Thomas. The last piece he left behind, still breathing, still loyal, when everything else had fallen silent. From afar, the soft rumble of a digger stirred. The burial was about to begin. But in that moment, between flag and earth, between a paw's touch on wood, there had already been the most sacred farewell. No trumpet needed, no words required, only a gaze and loyalty until the very last breath. When Shadow stepped back and lay down beside Nora, the cemetery felt as though someone had struck a solemn chord through the silence of every heart present. He lay still, head bowed, eyes closed, like a soldier who had just completed the final mission of his life. And then, without a word, the burial began. A male voice from the honor guard rang out, not loud, not sharp, but just enough to draw every gaze back to the casket. Sergeant Thomas A. Bennett, United States Army Unit Bravo 6, will now be laid to rest with honor and the love of a grateful nation. 4 soldiers stepped forward. They gently took hold of the casket's handles and began the descent. Every motion was slow, so slow it felt as if even the slightest jolt might awaken someone from slumber. The pulley squealed softly, metal wire sliding through steel hooks as the casket lowered inch by inch. Beneath it, clean wooden planks lined the grave, as if Mother Earth herself had prepared to receive her son with the utmost dignity. The casket descended. A light breeze brushed over the mourners, carrying the scent of fresh wood, damp grass, and the faint aroma of fading white roses. Nora stood closest. In her arms was the folded flag never once released. She held it to her chest, so tightly her fingers turned white from the pressure, so tightly the fabric scraped against her heart. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. No sobs, no cries, just the kind of tears that come from loss too vast for words or sound. Her eyes followed the casket, each inch sinking into the earth seemed to strip away another fragment of memory. Thomas, the brother who carried her through thick snow when their mother was alive. Thomas, the one who taught her to tie combat boots instead of ballet slippers. Thomas, who never ignored a call, never turned down a hug, never failed to give advice. Now, all that remained was a box of wood, a folded flag, and a hole in her life that could never be filled. When the casket touched bottom, a soldier pulled a small pouch from his uniform. He knelt and sprinkled the first handful of dirt onto the coffin. One by one, others followed, from lieutenants to privates, each silently stepping forward, heads bowed, offering a bit of earth as their farewell. No orders, no instructions. They just knew. And they did. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the flags lining the cemetery. One of the funeral officers pulled out a white cloth to offer Nora, but she didn't reach for it. She was still holding the flag with both arms, her whole chest, her entire heart. She pressed her cheek to the coarse fabric and whispered so softly, "I'm right here, Thomas." Behind her, Shadow lay unmoving, but his ears twitched, catching that sound. He didn't look at her. He stared at the grave for a long time, as if still refusing to believe his person wouldn't come back. Then came the sound of shovels. Each scoop of dirt fell steadily, not rushed. People slowly stepped back. The bugler packed away his trumpet. The honor guard lowered their rifles. The chaplain murmured a prayer. Nora remained motionless. Her eyes were dry, not because there were no more tears, but because her grief had surpassed what tears could express. When the last layer of soil was laid over the casket, the cemetery seemed to exhale a heavy breath. A soldier stepped forward with a white cross. He placed it at the head of the grave, engraved Thomas A. Bennett, Sergeant, United States Armed Forces, 1991, 2025. He served with honor. He loved without condition. Nora knelt. For the first time since the news arrived, she embraced the mound of earth, pressing her palm into the freshly laid grass as if hoping that beneath it her brother could still feel her presence. Shadow approached, not fast, not eager. He gently placed one paw at the edge of the grave, then sat beside her. Two silhouettes, one woman, one dog leaning on each other for strength, in a final farewell. The chapel doors closed behind them with a heavy thud-like stone, sighing under the weight of sorrow. The cold afternoon wind swept down the gray stone corridor, carrying with it the lingering scent of incense and the grief that hadn't yet faded. Above them, the Virginia sky was pale gray, as if it too was struggling to hold back a storm that hovered just behind the eyes. The procession began to move, pairs of polished military boots striking the ground with silent discipline. No one spoke. No one smiled. There were only footsteps, quiet breaths, and the dry rustle of fallen leaves beneath their soles. Shadow walked beside Nora, the leash loosely held, more symbolic than necessary, for he didn't need to be led. His thick fur darkened beneath the twilight hue, ears upright, not in alertness but in quiet attention, as if he were listening to something distant, indistinct, and otherworldly. Nora clutched the folded flag tightly to her chest, as if holding on to the last heartbeat of her brother. Cold wind slipped into her sleeves, but she felt nothing. Only her own breath, halting and heavy as though every step forward was pulling her farther away from something unnamed yet vital. And then, just a few paces from the chapel exit, Shadow stopped. Nora halted too, without thinking. Shadow didn't bark, didn't whimper. He simply turned his head, slowly, deliberately, as if an invisible voice had called his name from behind. His amber eyes locked onto a dark corner of the chapel interior. There was nothing there, only a damp patch of wall, an old wooden column, and a faint blue light streaming through stained glass above. Yet, in that moment, Nora felt a chill race down her spine. She turned too. No one, no movement. But what rooted her in place was the feeling, as if someone, some vague presence was standing there, saying nothing, just watching them with unseen eyes. Eyes filled with tenderness and quiet weight, perhaps even a faint smile. Nora's heart clenched. "Shadow," she whispered, voice cracking from the knot in her throat. But Shadow didn't move, his ears tilted slightly backward, as if listening and waiting. The air grew thick around them. The soldiers ahead had moved on, none of them turning back. Only two souls lingered, caught on something that hadn't yet been named. Then, after a pause that felt like a lifetime, Shadow let out a long breath. He bowed his head, slowly, not in sorrow, but in the way a soldier salutes a superior, a comrade, or the final farewell of a silent command. Nora didn't wipe the tear that slipped down her cheek. She simply stood there, the funeral wind sweeping through her mourning dress, yet not enough to chase away the chill settling deep in her bones. Shadow turned and resumed walking. No one urged him. No orders were given, but his stride had changed. It was no longer heavy like when they entered, nor hesitant, but rather like he'd heard something only he could understand. Nora lowered her head, gently resting a hand on Shadow's back as they stepped off the chapel porch. She didn't say a word, didn't ask, because she knew some things aren't meant to be explained, they're only meant to be felt. And in that fleeting moment between the gray dusk and the breeze sliding across the chapel roof, she felt one thing with utter clarity. Someone was still watching over them. No more footsteps, no more muffled sobs, only silence, not the kind that haunts, but the kind that fills. A presence no longer flesh and bone, but strong enough to make a dog turn his head, and a girl forget how to breathe for a few seconds. No one spoke in that moment. The chapel door had just closed behind them, sealing off a stillness colder than the spring wind that morning. Only the soft crunch of shoes on gravel and the steady weighted breaths of Shadow remained deep and heavy, like each inhale pulled in a memory too large to carry. Carter slowed his pace, his eyes fixed on the dog walking beside Nora. He had seen that look before, in war-torn fields, in the eyes of soldiers who had lost something, who had seen something no one else could understand. Shadow still glanced back toward the dark corner of the chapel he'd turned to just moments before. It was now just a patch of shadow untouched by the light. But there was something. No one could see it. No one could hear it. Except for Shadow. He saw something, Carter finally said, voice soft, almost afraid to disturb the thin veil between worlds. Nora turned to him, her face pale, eyes wavering between logic and something far harder to define. "What you mean?" Carter swallowed, hesitating before answering. "I don't know." But his eyes, they weren't searching. They were recognizing, like someone was standing there, waving goodbye. The wind brushed past them, gentle as a breath. The tree branches swayed above, casting shadows across the courtyard. The stone wall beside the chapel remained as cold as ever, yet today it seemed to hold the echo of something unspoken. Shadow let out a low whine. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy enough to raise goosebumps along Nora's arms. She looked at him, then back at the chapel. All at once, everything fell silent. No one said another word. Even the soldiers standing farther off, waiting to escort the casket, froze for a moment, as if time had pressed pause. The world stood still. A soft step echoed behind them. It was the old pastor. He walked slowly toward them, hand still holding a small, worn Bible. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a depth like someone who had seen things needing no explanation. "Sometimes," he said, voice low and steady as a church bell, "love doesn't leave that easily." That simple line, spoken in this exact moment, struck something deep within Nora like a tremor through her fingertips. She turned away, swallowing her tears. Carter said nothing. No one scoffed. No one demanded proof. They didn't need it, because somehow each of them in their own quiet, human way could feel that something lingered. Shadow no longer looked back, but his eyes still pointed in the same direction, as if trying to preserve the last image of something only he had truly seen. "Maybe he's not gone yet," Nora whispered, so softly only Carter and the pastor heard. No one answered, but no one denied it either. A moment later, Carter gently laid a hand on Shadow's back. His fur was soft and warm, but his body remained taut as a drawn bowstring. "Hey, buddy," Carter murmured. "It's okay. We're still here." Shadow glanced at him. For the first time since the funeral began, his ears drooped slightly, a gesture both of acknowledgment and of pain. And then slowly he turned away, not because anyone called him, not by command, but simply because he had seen enough. Seen, perhaps, for the last time. Carter withdrew his hand. He sighed, remembering battles long past where not everyone survived, and sometimes the spirits refused to let go until the last comrade had safely walked away. "Come on," the pastor nodded. "We still have a long way to go." Nora clutched the folded flag tightly. Her heart was heavy, but somehow something inside her had eased, a fragile peace, caught between doubt and faith. She didn't know if she believed in ghosts, didn't know if there was another world after this, but she believed in Shadow's gaze, believed in the stillness that hung in the chapel, and believed in things that didn't need to be seen, to be real. After the funeral, the small home on the outskirts of Virginia returned to its quiet routine, but it wasn't peace. It was an emptiness that lingered, as if all the sounds knew to silence themselves in honor of the one who had departed. Nora didn't turn on the TV, didn't play music. Even Thomas's old radio, still on the wooden shelf, had its cord pulled out. There was only the ticking of the wall clock and long, aching stretches of quiet. The vase by the window still held the same white chrysanthemums from the funeral. The folded flag sat on the table facing a photo of Thomas in uniform, beaming. But those were only symbols. The real presence had gone, leaving behind a hollow space no goodbye could fill. Shadow didn't enter the bedroom. Since the day they laid Thomas to rest, he had taken to lying by the front door. That first night, Nora left the door ajar, thinking he just wanted fresh air. But the next morning, he was still there, curled up, head resting on his paws, eyes half open, standing guard. And it continued the second night, the third, and every night thereafter. No one taught him to do it, but everyone knew it wasn't just instinct. Each evening, when the lights dimmed and the house went dark, only a soft nightlight glowed from the hallway. Shadow stayed by the door, still as a living statue. But what haunted Nora wasn't where he lay. It was where he looked. The far corner across from the bookshelf Thomas's reading spot, the old armchair, the reading lamp, the worn rug with the frayed edge. After the war, Thomas had made a ritual of drinking peppermint tea and reading there before bed. He once told Nora, "I just want to sleep every night without hearing gunfire." That little corner was the calmest place he'd ever known. Nora hadn't touched it since he died. Everything remained as it was, even the mug with the faint tea stain, and that very spot. Every night, Shadow would growl, not loud, not angry, just a deep, soft rumble like a warning to something unseen. But there was no one there, no movement, no shadow, no draft strong enough to stir the lamp. Only a gaze long and focused from Shadow's eyes to the empty chair. Nora first heard the growl on the fourth night. She bolted upright, thinking someone was at the door. But when she came close, she found Shadow still lying there, eyes wide, staring into the room, ears taut, throat vibrating with a sound dogs only make when sensing something wrong. "Shadow," she whispered. He glanced at her, then looked back quietly, saying, "It's fine. I'm still guarding." Nora couldn't sleep. She sat beside him, back against the wall, eyes fixed on that same chair. Part of her hoped it was just grief. But another part, deeper, whispered, "Sometimes Loyalty so fierce can anchor things the living can no longer perceive. And so the nights passed, sleepless. Still, she developed a habit brewing hot tea, sitting beside Shadow, watching the moonlight spill through the glass. They never spoke. One woman, one dog, listening to the silence. Sometimes Shadow didn't growl, but sometimes he sat up, ears alert, eyes sharp. Not an old dog, but a K9 back on duty, just like the days of war and sand and gunfire. In those moments, Nora clutched her tea, heart twisting, not from fear, but from a grief that lingered like a past that refused to leave. One night, she drifted to sleep on the couch. In her dream, Thomas entered the room. He didn't speak. He just sat in his chair, book in hand. Shadow lay at his feet like always. Then Thomas looked at her, smiling, soft, warm, like he used to. She woke up with a start. The living room was still dim, the chair still empty. But Shadow was looking at it. His eyes glistened, but he wasn't sad. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He just looked. Perhaps, without knowing, Thomas still came home each night, and Shadow, bound by a loyalty that outlived even death, was doing what he had always done, standing guard for his soldier, even if that soldier now lived only in memory. The room inside Henderson's law office was unusually small and quiet. Black and white photographs hung in perfect alignment on the wall. A dark wooden desk gleamed as if someone had polished it daily without fail. Nora sat at the edge of her chair, gripping her handbag tightly, her heart in turmoil. Like a storm had just passed through her chest and left silence in its wake. Outside the window, the Virginia sky was gloomy. Heavy gray clouds hung low, threatening rain, as if they were carrying the emotions of the woman sitting here, a younger sister who never got the chance to say goodbye. Mr. Henderson, a silver-haired man with glasses, slowly opened a pale brown envelope. He didn't say much. He simply slid a piece of paper forward, his eyes calm and sorrowful. Thomas wrote this by hand. He asked me not to read it until you arrived. Nora took the letter. The paper was light yellow, creased slightly at the corners. Thomas's handwriting was just as she remembered, strong but not rigid, the kind of penmanship from a man used to discipline, but still hiding a soft heart somewhere underneath. Nora, if you're holding this letter, it means I didn't have enough time left to say all the things I should have said long ago. I'm sorry for leaving so suddenly, but wars don't always end on the battlefield. Some battles follow you home. They lie dormant in your heart, waiting for a moment of weakness to rise again. I tried to hide them for you, for Mom, but maybe that only pushed you further away. I need you to understand this. Shadow isn't just a dog. He's a witness, a friend, the only teammate who's seen the things I could never speak aloud. On our last mission in Mosul, we were ordered to track down a group of insurgents hiding weapons inside an abandoned school. But when we breached the building, we didn't just find guns. We found a child. A boy, maybe 10, crouched in the corner, eyes wide and frozen with terror. No one noticed him. No one except Shadow. He didn't bark, didn't charge. He just walked over slowly, as if to say, "You're safe now, son." His name was Arif, and because of Shadow, a child lived. What I want you to know is, Shadow wasn't trained just to fight. He was born to protect, not just the body, but the parts of my soul I thought couldn't be saved. If I go before him, I want Shadow to live the rest of his life as part of our family, Don't bind him back to discipline. Let him choose where his heart belongs. I trust he'll find his own path. You're the only person I trust to understand that. The last lines were slightly shaky-like. The writer had paused to hold back tears. Thank you for being the one reason I always wanted to come home. Thomas. Nora placed the letter on the desk, hands covering her face. Her tears didn't fall with sound. They just flowed silently like Thomas himself. He never spoke too much, but when he did, it tore through her heart. Mr. Henderson said nothing. Then he gently laid a hand over the worn envelope. He entrusted Shadow to you, and he asked for nothing more than what's written. Nora nodded. Inside her, grief and pride throbbed like two heartbeats out of sync. Now she understood why Shadow always guarded the door, why he whimpered each night facing the corner where Thomas once read, why he growled at the photo no one could explain. He wasn't reacting out of instinct. He was in pain keeping a promise only he and Thomas understood. To protect the family, even when the other was gone. She stood, carefully folded the letter, and placed it into the breast pocket of her coat, as if tucking Thomas back against her heart. One last time. Outside, the rain had started. Light droplets tapping against the car window like fingers too gentle to disturb sorrow. When Nora stepped inside the house, Shadow was still lying there in the same spot. But this time, when he saw her, he didn't just look. He stood, walked to her, and touched his nose gently to the pocket where the letter rested. She knelt beside him, hand resting lightly on his collar. "He told me," she whispered. "I know now, Shadow." And in that moment, it felt like all three of them, she, Thomas, and Shadow, were still inside the same story. Not at the end, just turning the page to a different mission. Nora sat quietly in the living room, pale sunlight drifting through the sheer curtains, painting faint streaks across the wooden floor. In her hands was Thomas's letter, the paper now slightly warped from tears, but every word still intact. Her voice trembled as she read, but her eyes followed memories only Thomas and Shadow had ever seen. "Nora, I don't know if you'll read this while I'm still alive, but if you are, then part of your heart has just broken. I know it, and I'm sorry." Nora clutched the letter tighter, her heart twisted, aching in places that didn't have names. Shadow lay at her feet, head resting against the leg of the chair, his eyes still fixed on Thomas's photo above the fireplace. As Nora read on, the house around her faded into the background, replaced by words that turned into images and images that breathed. "I want to tell you about the last mission, not because I'm proud of it, but because I learned something in the harshest place on earth. We were sent to a small village near Mosul. Intel said there was a weapons cache hidden among civilians. It sounded routine locate, secure, extract. But while sweeping the third house near the village edge, Shadow froze, right in front of a bullet-pocked wall. He didn't bark, didn't move. He pressed his nose against a crack near the floor and let out a long, low whine I'd never heard before. Nora looked down at him. It was as if Shadow was remembering too. His ears twitched slightly. His tail moved just once, no sound, no reason, just memory. I went over, pulled off a loose board. Behind the crumbling concrete, I saw eyes. A boy, frail. Big brown eyes, but too dry to cry anymore. He'd been there at least 2 days. No food. His mother had shielded him during an earlier explosion. Her body still lay behind the wall. His name was Arif. If not for Shadow, the boy would have died that day. But that dog who can't speak, who wasn't trained to feel empathy, sensed life amid death. Nora pressed her hand to her chest. Thomas had never told this story, not once. But now, through ink and paper, she could hear the heavy breaths, the crackle of fire, the echo of screams, and the whimper of Shadow beside a pile of rubble. I carried Arif out. His hands were cold like metal. He didn't speak, just wrapped his arms around my neck. The whole unit stopped. No one expected to find a life under that dust. When the chopper came, the boy clung to Shadow, wouldn't let go. Can you believe it, Nora? He didn't cry for his mother. He cried when they pulled him away from Shadow. The words hit like a hammer. Nora pictured it, the burning sky, the child of war, hugging a dog he'd never met, speaking no English, yet somehow understanding everything. That night, we camped outside the village. I sat alone, Shadow beside me, like always. I stroked his back, whispered, "You did more than anyone trained you to do." He looked up, didn't move, just stared straight into my eyes, as if to say, "I know, but that's my job." I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking, in a place full of hate, full of war, how did a dog see what we humans forgot? Arif wasn't a target. He wasn't a priority. But Shadow stopped anyway. Nora folded the letter into her lap, burying her face in her knees. Below, Shadow raised his head, pressed closer into her side, and let out a deep breath, one that sounded like it carried memories too. I need you to understand this, Nora. Duty doesn't end when the gunfire stops. It only begins when you understand why you ever picked up the weapon at all. Those final words burned into her mind. Thomas's voice, quiet but commanding, echoed through her heart. It wasn't just a philosophy. It was a living will. He hadn't lived to fight. He'd lived to protect, to love. And Shadow, the silent, loyal one, was proof of that. Nora wiped her tears. Outside, the sky was changing. Evening approached, and inside that old wooden house, a sister and an aging dog quietly held on to what was left, not in memory alone, but in an unshakable bond. She remained seated as the sun dipped lower, its light casting slanted shadows through the window. Thomas's letter still lay open on the table like a map to the past. The wind blew through the curtains, brushing strands of hair across her face. But Nora didn't move. She kept staring at the last sentence written in darker ink, like he had paused a long time before finishing. "If I go first, let Shadow choose where he wants to go." One line, one wish, one belief. But for Nora, it shook something loose inside her, a pillar of logic that had held her up through the funeral. Now it cracked. She sat frozen, chest aching, breath unsteady. Shadow lay in the same spot, his corner of the room, head resting on his paws, his ears no longer sharp like they once were, but his eyes always watching her. She turned toward him, and then, as if the dam finally broke, Nora doubled over, face in her hands, sobs crashing from her throat like a tide no longer held back. For the first time since the funeral, she cried out loud. No more silence, no more holding it in, just grief raw and breaking. The grief of someone who finally realized the only piece of her brother left was curled quietly at her feet. "Thomas," she choked out, "why didn't you let me hear that line sooner?" She reached out, grabbing Shadow's collar, resting her forehead against his. "He doesn't need to choose where to go. He's already here." Her voice cracked, dissolving into tears. Because he is family? Shadow didn't react dramatically, but the way he leaned closer, placing his head softly into her lap, told her everything she needed to know. No words, no commands, just a bond that no longer needed language, where dog and human hearts could finally meet. In her mind, the image replayed Thomas in Mosul, Shadow walking through debris to save a fragile thread of life. And she couldn't help but wonder, maybe Thomas had cried like this too. But no one ever saw it, no one but Shadow. Nora stood, walked to the desk, and pulled out an old photo. Thomas, sitting on the porch steps. Shadow, younger then, resting his head on Thomas's lap, ears perked, eyes locked on the camera. Their faces mirrored one another, serene, solid, and steady. She looked down at the dog, now gray around the muzzle, eyes sunken with time. But the spirit? Still unbroken. "You chose right," she whispered. "Only he knew the parts of you you never said out loud." That night, Nora didn't let Shadow sleep by the door. She cleaned a space in her room, laid down Thomas's old blanket. When she called his name, Shadow hesitated just for a moment, then entered quietly, like stepping into something sacred. He curled up beside the bed, glancing once toward the empty space where Thomas used to sleep. Nora turned off the light. No more tears, only darkness, soft and still, and the silent presence of the last two souls still standing in what once was a family of three. On the dresser, the letter remained open, its final line bold-etched like a vow. Let Shadow choose where to go. And now he had. He chose to stay, to protect, to love one more time. Mornings in the suburbs were quieter than most places. No honking cars, no bustling crowds, just the gentle whisper of wind threading through trees lining the narrow road that led to the rusted iron gate of a 2-story ash-gray building. This was St. Jude's home, the place Thomas had secretly donated to for years. Nora stopped the car in front of the gate, staring at the faded painted sign. She had never been here while Thomas was alive. Everything he did had been silent, just like how he lived. But now, after reading the final lines of his letter, when she read that Thomas once wrote, "If Shadow ever needs a new purpose, let him find it in the place where I left part of my heart," she understood she had to come. Beside her, Shadow sat quietly in the car. He no longer stuck his head out the window or barked whenever the car stopped, but his eyes remained sharp, deep, steady, aged eyes like someone who'd seen too many moonless nights. The gate creaked open. An elderly nun, petite and silver-haired, stepped out to greet her. A small wooden crucifix was pinned to the front of her white blouse. "You must be Nora," she said, her voice gentle like smoke. Nora nodded, shook her hand, and introduced Shadow. "This dog, he was Thomas's comrade," she said, lowering her eyes briefly, "and now he's my family." The nun offered a sad smile. "He used to come here at Christmas years ago, never loud, never asking for thanks. Just came to fix the roof, repaint the fence, and play with the children. A silent soldier and a kind one." They walked into the courtyard. Children played freely, running through uneven flower beds. A few older ones swept the yard or drew with chalk on the cement. But in the farthest corner, beneath a large maple tree, sat a small figure alone. "That's Adam," the nun whispered. "He's 8, lost his parents in a robbery when he was 5. Since then, he hasn't spoken to anyone. Doctors diagnosed him with PTSD. Once, he had a full-blown panic attack just from hearing a motorcycle backfire near the gate." Nora clenched her hands. She glanced at Shadow. His ears dipped slightly, but his eyes had locked onto the tiny figure under the tree. No one told him what to do. No one gave a command. Shadow simply walked away from her, slow and steady toward Adam. Adam hugged his knees, eyes weary. He didn't see Shadow at first, but when he heard the sound of soft paws on earth, he looked up, his dark eyes empty of fear, but also void of light. Shadow stopped a short distance from him. Not too close. He sat silent and still like an old sentinel, respectful and unintrusive. The whole yard seemed to freeze. A few children paused their games, turning to watch, and then something no one expected happened. Adam raised his hand very slowly and touched the top of Shadow's head. Just one touch. But it was the first time he'd touched a living creature in 3 years. Nora brought a hand to her mouth, muffling a sob. The nun's eyes filled with tears. Adam looked at Shadow and almost involuntarily whispered, "Does this dog follow commands?" The first word he'd spoken in 3 years. Shadow didn't move, just tilted his head gently like a nod. Adam looked up at Nora. His eyes were no longer hollow. "Can I sit with him for a little while?" Nora nodded, lips trembling. "He's here for you." And so, beneath the old maple tree, an aging dog and a wounded child sat together. No need for words, no need for explanations. Just two souls who'd seen too much now finding each other quietly, naturally, as if it had been destined long ago. Outside, the wind rustled through autumn leaves, dropping them softly on the boy's shoulders. Shadow looked up at the sky, then back at Adam. Maybe, just maybe, he had found where he was meant to be. Beneath the fading sun, the ground was damp beneath the golden leaves. Adam, the boy everyone at St. Jude's called the Silent One, sat with legs tucked, shoulders hunched, his fingers curled in the air like they weren't sure what to do. But today, something was different. No barking, no coaxing, just a graying dog sitting beside him as if they'd known each other for years. Shadow didn't get too close, didn't avert his gaze. He chose the perfect distance, not too near, not imposing-like. He understood that some wounds didn't need healing, only acknowledgement. Adam glanced at him. No fear, no curiosity, just a cautious stare, as if asking, "Are you real? How long will you stay? Will you leave like everyone else?" Shadow answered with silence. No growling, no tail wagging, just eyes warm and unwavering like a wall that had withstood years of storm. Minutes passed. Nora stood from afar with the nun, motionless. They dared not move, afraid the smallest action might shatter the fragile moment unfolding. The wind passed by. A dry leaf landed on Shadow's back. He didn't flinch. Still, he sat, and then a voice, so soft it could have been the wind breathing. This dog. Nora's heart skipped, her hands clenched, her pulse quickened. Does he follow commands? An 8-year-old boy's question after 3 years of silence fell like a silent quake. It wasn't a question about obedience. It was a whisper that meant, if he listens, would he listen to me? Is there something in me that would make him stay? Shadow tilted his head, an old familiar gesture Thomas once called his thinking pose. No sound, no command, but enough to make Adam hold his gaze for the first time, not looking away. The playground froze. A few children drifted further back, stunned. A boy who never spoke, never played, never let anyone near, was asking about a dog. Nora stepped forward, but the nun gently raised her hand. "Don't," she whispered. "Let it be his choice." Shadow stayed still. Adam slowly extended his hand, placing it on the ground, creating a safe space. His eyes never left Shadow's. Then he asked clearer this time, who did he belong to? So many layers in that question. Nora swallowed hard. She took a step closer, kneeling a few feet away. "My brother," she replied softly. "A soldier, a good man." Adam stayed quiet, his fingers tracing invisible lines into the fallen leaves. "Will he come back for him?" the boy asked, voice trembling like someone who just dreamed of something beautiful and feared it wasn't real. Nora hesitated. She couldn't lie, but she couldn't break the boy again either. She took one more step, knelt, and looked him in the eye. He's gone, but Shadow is still here, and now he's looking for a new friend. Adam looked at her, and for the first time, the fog in his eyes began to clear. "Can I be his friend?" Nora nodded. She said nothing more, just smiled, her eyes wet. Then Shadow rose, stepped forward slowly, gently, and placed his head on Adam's lap. No one had taught him to do that. There was no signal. He just knew. Adam sank his fingers into Shadow's fur, lips quivering as if he were touching a forgotten part of himself, long buried. And in that moment, between a wounded boy and an aging dog, a silent bond was sealed. No reasons, no conditions, just the right time and the right soul. Nora looked up at the sky. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, brushing her shoulder. The sky wasn't perfectly blue, but bright enough for her to believe, even though Thomas was gone, a part of his love still lived through the warm, quiet eyes of Shadow. That morning, when Nora returned to St. Jude's to pick up Shadow, the nun just smiled and said, "Some souls, once they've chosen to stay, no one has the right to take them away." Shadow didn't need goodbyes. He had chosen this place the moment he laid his head on Adam's lap, not out of duty and not by command. He simply knew. A child needed him. And just as Thomas once did, now Adam did too. Nora stood at the edge of the playground, watching Adam sit cross-legged with an old comic book. Beside him lay Shadow curled up, eyes half closed, ears slightly perked, as if all was on guard. No one had trained him to do that, but he knew this was his role now, the quiet shield between a boy and his fear. A social worker approached with a file and whispered to Nora, "We've never seen Adam this stable in 2 years. No more night screams, no more avoiding touch, no more self-harm." She paused, glancing at Shadow. "That dog is not just a dog." Nora didn't reply. She only clutched the shawl around her shoulders tighter, holding back the tide of emotion rising in her chest. That day, St. Jude officially decided Shadow would stay as part of a special therapy, not bound to any program or protocol, simply this: if something could bring a silent child back to life, it should be kept. They made a small collar tag engraved Shadow, canine companion, special bond with Adam. Nora held the tag, brushing her finger over each letter. She remembered the day Thomas first brought Shadow home, fresh from discharge. Back then, the dog was still full of energy, glued to his side like a shadow. She had once joked, "How long are you going to keep him?" Thomas smiled and said, "Until the day he finds a new mission one I don't have to order him into." And now, in the simple grounds of a children's home, that mission had begun, quiet, unarmed, with no medals, but sacred. That evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, Nora returned one last time to say goodbye. She sat beside Adam and Shadow. The boy was whispering stories no one else could hear into Shadow's ear. "You'll take care of him, right?" Nora asked. Adam nodded. "He doesn't need anyone to tell him to protect me. He just does." Nora laughed through stinging eyes. She leaned down, kissed Shadow on the head. "You found your new soldier?" Shadow didn't turn, but the slow, steady wag of his tail told her he understood. On the drive home, Nora didn't turn on the radio. She let the car roll in silence, the wind slipping through the windows and the amber glow of the city fading behind her. She didn't feel loss anymore, because a part of Thomas was still alive, not just in memory, but in the continuing journey of a loyal soul named Shadow. A dog who didn't need a command to know when to stay. And when it was time to begin a new mission, Nora arrived at the cemetery on an early winter morning. The damp chill slipped through her coat, making each step on the gravel path feel heavier. She carried a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, a small tin box filled with Shadow's favorite treats, and a handwritten letter penned in blue ink on slightly yellowed paper, the same kind Thomas used to write letters home. The grave lay in the third row, beneath the gnarled branches of an old elm. The headstone read, "Thomas Granger," and beneath his name, a quote he had once chosen himself. "Duty doesn't end when the gunfire stops." Nora sat down, laid the flowers by the stone, then slowly opened the tin. Inside was an old handkerchief Thomas had once used on a hiking trip with her when they were 15. The memory floated past like a cloud across the skylight, unreachable. She traced the edges of the letter, took a deep breath, and began to read softly, as if Thomas were right there beside her, basking in the late morning sun. "Dear Thomas, I don't know if you'll get this where you are, but I'm writing anyway because I know the one thing I never did was say enough. Today, I came to tell you about Shadow. He's still alive, not just breathing, but living with purpose. You once said, 'If I go first, let him choose where to go.' And you know what? He did. And I believe he chose right. I brought Shadow to St. Jude orphanage you used to help. I never imagined that would be the place fate led him to. There's a boy there named Adam, 8 years old, lost both parents in a robbery, hadn't spoken a word in 3 years. But after just minutes with Shadow, he looked up and asked, 'Does this dog know how to take commands?' Thomas, did you hear that?" I cried, because in that moment, I knew you were still here, through him. That boy, he's like you were, eyes always looking far away, like trying to find a way out of the maze in his memory. And Shadow didn't need to be told. He just knew where to sit, who to sit with. He's no longer a K-9, no longer carrying orders on his back. But every morning he rises early, sits outside Adam's door like he's standing guard over a little soldier's dreams. They call him a therapy companion. But I think he's just keeping the last promise he made to you. I remember the last time you stood on our front steps, looked at me and said, 'If I'm ever gone, don't grieve too long, okay?' I laughed then. Thought you were joking. Now I understand. You weren't afraid of death. You were afraid of being forgotten. But I promise you with everything I have left that your name, your smile, and what you stood for will never fade. I'll tell the children about the soldier who shielded a wounded comrade with bare hands, about the man who never raised his voice to his dog, yet earned its lifelong loyalty, about a brother who never stopped fighting for a reason, even when the battlefield changed. I'll come back every year, with chrysanthemums. Yes, the flowers you hated because they always meant sadness. But I chose them because they last long, like memories. I'll bring cookies for Shadow, if he's still able to walk then, and I'll remind Adam his companion was once a warrior, a hero without a cape, only a wide enough heart to love and a dog to understand him. I miss you, Thomas, but the missing no longer gnaws at me. It's something I've learned to carry, like Shadow carries his tag, not to show off, but to remember where he came from. With love, your sister, Nora. She folded the letter with care, slipped it into a small plastic pouch, and tucked it beneath a pile of pebbles near the stone. A breeze picked up, stirring a few chrysanthemum petals that floated onto the edge of the headstone like a belated winter kiss. As she stood, Nora didn't cry. She just looked up at the sky and whispered, "Hey, Shadow found his new soldier?" That morning the sky wasn't dazzlingly blue, nor was the sunlight golden like in paintings. It was simply a soft, clear light, warm like the breath of someone you love passing through a dream. The backyard of St. Jude remained quiet, as usual. The children were in class, and the small courtyard held only lingering morning dew and slivers of sun peeking through branches. The old maple had shed most of its leaves, its bare limbs now standing in silence like a witness deep in thought. Beneath that tree, two figures lay side by side, one boy, one dog. Adam was curled up, head resting on a small backpack, comic book still open in his arms. His eyelids fluttered gently, lips curved into the kind of sleep that's both peaceful and far away. Beside him, Shadow lay with his head resting on the boy's legs, his black and gray coat rising and falling with calm breaths. He wasn't fully asleep, just resting. His ears twitched, always alert, ready to react at the slightest sound. But this morning there was no sound, only wind. Wind that slipped through the trees, not strong enough to lift a leaf, just enough to make the air whisper. It passed over Adam's hair, across Shadow's aged fur, then drifted toward the wooden fence, where a plaque bore the names of all the children who'd once called this place home. No one was present in that moment, no witnesses. But if someone had come by, they would have stopped, not because something dramatic was happening, but because the scene was utterly peaceful. A dog who had once heard gunfire, who had raced through smoke to save comrades, now lay quietly in the sun. And a boy who once hid in life's darkest corners now slept calmly, his hand gently resting on the back of that dog, as if it were home. From a second-floor window, Nora watched in silence. She didn't call out. She didn't want to break the spell. Inside her, something softened, like the slow return of rain after a long drought. Not a storm, just a gentle, steady soaking, enough to bring life back. Sister Agnes stepped beside her and asked gently, "Will you return?" Nora nodded, eyes never leaving the pair below. "I'll always return, because I know Thomas still lives here." The nun said nothing more. They stood together in silence. The wind rose once more, not forcefully, but this time it carried something different, like someone had just brushed across the sky. From the branch above where Adam and Shadow lay, the last maple leaf let go. It spiraled gently, circled once, and landed between the two sleeping souls. Adam didn't stir, but a small smile curled on his lips, and Shadow, though eyes shut, wagged his tail just once. No command was given, no call was made, but the wind, the light, and the moment all whispered the same thing. Everything that needed to happen has happened. There are mornings so quiet you forget the world was ever loud. And in those moments, when there are no sirens, no orders, no farewells, when a child and a dog lie side by side beneath the morning sun, you understand. Wars may end, but love never dies. A voice begins to speak, not clear who it belongs to, not important. Maybe it's Nora writing a small book about her brother. Maybe it's the pastor who once saw Shadow leap into a coffin. Or maybe it's just memory speaking through the rustling leaves, blending into the breath of the earth. There are warriors who don't need guns to keep peace. That was Thomas, the one who chose to save a child in a war zone instead of retreating. The one who took in a snarling dog and turned him into the most loyal friend. That was Carter, the quiet one who always stood behind the fallen. And that was Shadow, the bearer of all their memories, walking on a path no one marked, but always moving forward. And there are dogs who don't need commands to know when it's time to love and when it's time to let go. Because of love, he left the battlefield when the one he loved was gone. Because of love, he looked back into the shadows where humans had grown blind to what still called out. Because of love, he lay down beside a strange child and stayed. No one told him. No one rewarded him. He stayed because he knew he was needed. This world isn't short on weapons, noise, or people shouting to prove they're right. But the world still needs those quiet souls, the loyal hearts who live by instinct and honor to guard the last fragile fragments of peace left in human hearts. Shadow and Thomas's story isn't about war. It's about a bond, unbound by rules, unspoken, but strong enough to survive loss, time, and death. Adam is still at St. Jude. He laughs now, sometimes tells stories to the other kids about a nameless soldier and a dog who never needed a leash. Nora still visits, bringing slices of apple, scraps of paper, and silent hugs. Shadow has grown old, his steps no longer swift. But every morning he still walks to the courtyard and waits on the bench, the one Adam likes best, and if one day he doesn't get up again, there may be no funeral, no speech, just someone whispering, "You did good. Now rest, quiet warrior." The story of Shadow and Thomas is not just a heroic ballad of loyalty. It is a gentle reminder that love, whether between people or between a human and a dog, always leaves a miraculous imprint on souls once broken. German shepherds like Shadow aren't just strong and intelligent, they know how to heal through their eyes, their breath, and their quiet presence. They're not just pets, they're comrades, family, and the silent anchor we hold on to in our darkest hours. Hopefully, after this story, each of us will learn to slow down just a little, to hear the heartbeat of those seemingly small creatures who love us with all they have. And if one day you find yourself looking into the eyes of a dog waiting to be loved, please don't look away, because maybe you just passed by a silent warrior who is still trying to find a reason to stay.